Hi, this is William from the University of Chicago, and in this video we'll be talking about open science. This presentation was prepared by myself and Anastasia Sorokina, a colleague of mine, and she presented this presentation at our Reproducibility Journal Club. So this was intended to be an introduction to open science that was based around the Spellman, Gilbert, and Corker 2017 preprint, which I think is now a book chapter titled Open Science, What, Why, and How. So in this presentation, I hope to cover a few things. Firstly, how did open science come about? What does open science mean? Why we need open science? And how to do open science. In our Reproducibility Journal Club, which is targeted at grad students and postdocs and other early career researchers, we surveyed them and asked, when did you first hear of open science? And you can see the majority have heard of open science many years ago for the first time. But there are some of us who have only heard about it a year ago and maybe in the past few months. Open science has taken a forefront in the media, especially because of the current coronavirus pandemic. You can see here from these articles from Nature, Stanford News, and Fortune, open science has been a big part of the scientists' response to the current coronavirus pandemic. So for example, sharing data and research as fast as possible to make sure that information gets to the right places. To discuss open science in general, we need to first think about what came before open science and how science has operated in the past. In the very ancient days, back in towards the 1500s, 1600s, science used to be very closed. What this meant was discoveries were only shared when profitable to do so. And in the cases where you did share them, for example, if you need to verify a finding, they were shared in code, so you had to rely on the other scientists breaking that code. Around the 1600s, the late 1600s, scientific journals came along, which to help ease the transmission of information between scientists. By 1699, there were 30 scientific journals. Then, towards the more modern times, Project Gutenberg started in 1971, which was an attempt to digitize cultural works and make them public domain access. Then came the internet, the World Wide Web, which was invented in 1989, which started as scientists needed to rapidly share information. After that, OpenScience.com was created in approximately 1990, and now the current most popular preprint servers called Archive started in 1991. But those don't quite capture what is currently happening, which is the open science revolution, this new open science movement that has originated. So to give you some context, Felisa Wolf-Simon in 2010 published a paper called A Bacterium That Can Grow by Using Arsenic Instead of Phosphorus. So this was a NASA researcher who published the discovery of an arsenic-based bacterium in Science, suggesting extraterrestrial life. Now, this finding was widely criticized, especially on Twitter, where arsenic life hashtag raised a lot of problems with this paper, and it was almost like an open peer review on the internet. This finding was quite remarkable and extraordinary and caught a lot of media attention. Multiple research groups replicated the experiments and made their own findings public on that archive server, and found that there was no evidence for arsenic-based bacteria. So science was forced to make the original article free of paywalls, but has since refused to retract it despite the flawed analyses and misleading conclusions. So that started a bit of a rumbling in the biology sciences. And then after that, in 2011, Daryl Bem, who was a very well-respected and well-known psychologist, published a paper called Feeling the Future, Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influences on Cognitive and Affect. He ran 9 experiments totaling 1,000 participants showing support for precognition, which is the ability to predict things in the future. The analyses appeared to be typical, standard for the field, and it was published in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology after peer review. But it's clear that people cannot predict the future like this. A pre-registered replication failed to find any of the reported effects in 3 attempts, so Ritchie, Wiseman, and French in 2012. Journal of Personality and Social Psychology refused to publish this replication, despite having published the original paper. And furthermore, this replication was rejected at British Journal of Psychology because Bem was one of the reviewers on that paper. So another pivotal paper in 2011 was Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson, which showed evidence that listening to music caused people to become younger. And this is obviously untrue, but they showed by doing so that this was due to researcher degrees of freedom or questionable research practices. So an example of those questionable research practices, in BEM 2011, suspicious sample sizes were used, so they were multiples of 50, and they were different across all 9 studies. So they sometimes were 50, sometimes were 150, 200. It was unclear what the hypotheses and designs were up front. It seems that some of the experiments were actually combinations of 2 experiments. So for example, 100 participants did an experiment a certain way, whereas another 50 participants did an experiment a different way, but the data was aggregated together. The majority of the tests in statistical tests in BEM 2011 were also one-tailed tests and involved some non-standard measures that were constructed post hoc, so some averaging of measures. And these were all featured in the Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson paper that showed you could generate a high proportion of false positives using these questionable research practices. If you're interested in knowing more, I reviewed the Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson paper in an earlier video that I made. This spurred a huge movement in psychology specifically. So seeing many efforts and failures to replicate known effects, this culminated in what it was called the Reproducibility Project Psychology, which was published in 2015, which showed that the majority of findings could not be replicated. So this triggered a movement amongst psychological scientists and now scientists in general about how we need to improve the replication reproducibility of science. And one way we do this is by creating an open and transparent movement in science. So what prevents replications from occurring? So this is reasons for why the open science is needed. Firstly, there's a lack of access to full methods. So in published journal articles, method sections are often brief and incomplete. And some decisions by the researcher in the design are not included in those method sections. And furthermore, as time goes on, the materials and stimuli used in those experiments disappear. So it's difficult to, from just those method sections alone, replicate those experiments. There's also a lack of access to the original data from these experiments. With the invention of computers and the improvement of information technology, now we can start archiving the data. But with the changes in technology, data might be in old formats and lost without backups. So it's hard to get access to the original data to confirm or replicate the original statistical findings. Furthermore, there's a lack of access to analytic procedures and code, and this also includes experimental code. So without that code freely available open, it is hard to see what was actually conducted or run in the experiment, and furthermore, how the statistical analyses were conducted. For example, point-and-click statistical software is not reproduction friendly. So for example, software like SPSS, you can conduct an ANOVA by using the interface via menus. However, it's possible that you might have changed the options and someone else taking the same data might not run the exact same statistical analysis because it is not recorded in the point-and-click software. Another problem that prevents replications from occurring is known as the file draw problem, which is the fact that replication studies tend to be difficult to publish and are then stashed away. So it is true of whether the replication experiment is a failure or a success. It's just seen that a replication study is not seen as very valuable to a journal, and journals tend to not publish that kind of research, rather incentivized to publish shiny research that might generate readership. There's also a lack of access to publications because scientific journals tend to put up paywalls, forcing university libraries to pay exorbitant amounts to provide access to that taxpayer-funded research. If that journal is not available to a researcher, then it becomes much more difficult to replicate that experiment and to confirm the research that was presented in that paper. And lastly, there's been discontent with reporting and use of standard statistics. The use of null hypothesis significance testing is prevalent in the field of psychology specifically, and generally across most of the sciences. And the reporting and interpretation of these statistics can be inconsistent, missing, or incorrect. So these are all factors that prevent replications from occurring. And it's important to note that these problems aren't exactly new. They've been around since before this open sciences movement has started in 2011. They were existing before. Reproducibility movements have also been around before. They've been many waves of attempts to increase reproducibility. It just so happens that this current one has legs and it seems to be sticking around. So it's important for early career researcher scientists and all scientists in general to be ready for the transition to transparent and open science. So, what is the current open science revolution? What is the open science nowadays? Well, taking a definition from Wikipedia, a term for some of the proposed reforms to make scientific practices more transparent and to increase the availability of information that allows others to evaluate and use the research. So you can see there in this figure, open science involves open data, open source software, open methodology, open peer review, open access, and open educational resources. All of these things target the problems that I listed above before this slide. And why has this open science revolution sort of stuck around now? Why has it become popular in this current time? Well, firstly, the technology has improved to such a state that it's possible. But there is some difficulties with that. Most researchers will not add a new practice, for example, pre-registration, or take a new technology like R to run their statistics rather than something like SPSS, and add that to their workflow without the incentives to do so. So to incentivize, if we are able to incentivize open science, we might be able to incentivize these practices. And as I mentioned before, the code and data can be difficult to access. And most of the time, if they are accessible, they are often stashed in supplementary materials. So they're hidden away. One reason why there is a need for open science to start now more than ever is that younger scientists are more diverse in background. And that means there's more procedures that are being produced and developed, and that vary across all labs. This might mean that if we develop more procedures and we do not open it up, then there's the chances of closed procedures that only one lab is able to do and no other lab is able to reproduce or replicate to confirm whether their findings are actually correct. And a paper by Ioannidis in 2005, which was very controversial, is that most published research findings are false. And in this paper, he suggested that due to things like bias in publishing, due to underpowered studies, most of the published literature happen to be false positives. That is that our positive predictive value is below 50%. This paper I reviewed in my very first video, so if you'd like to learn more about that, you can check that out. but it appears that as a science-wide problem, the majority of the literature is left unchecked and may not be accurate. And lastly, we have insights from psychological science itself. We should know how to fix these problems. For example, we should know how to stop ourselves from confirmation bias or groupthink. And we know that the publish or perish model incentivizes low-powered studies. We know that it is profitable currently in our model to have a lot of studies published, and to do that we want significant effects, and that might involve a lot of low-powered studies rather than a lot of high-powered studies that are accurate and reliable. Here are some other reasons for why open science is important. So you can see here the efficiency of is improved with open science. So for example, with more data, you can conduct more research and more analyses from the same set of data. This is evident in big data sets. For example, collaborations across labs who do many studies and collate the data all at once. Open science can improve innovation, so it can reduce delays in the reuse of scientific research. Another thing that we can point to is that open science may reduce the number of false positives and reduce the number of research that is relying on those replicating those false effects. Open science also leads to greater awareness amongst the public and promotes collaborative efforts globally. Science also plays a key role in today's knowledge economies, and open science critically, and the most important part that has been featured in this presentation, is that it allows greater evaluation and scrutiny of the scientific research and allows us to correct the scientific literature. One example of this collaborative open science project is OpenWorm and the Allen Brain Atlas. So the pictures here you can see the worm is C. elegans, and started in 2003. It was a project to map the whole nervous system of C. elegans, and it was radically open at the time. All the data that is published from this OpenWorm model is in open access journals and made publicly available. So anyone can access it. All software is free and open source, so it means that anyone can be a team member. It's an international effort, and anyone can access the data for whatever they need to improve their research. So Allen mouse and human brain analyses, that's a picture down the bottom, are free and available to the public as well, and were created for the purpose of combining anatomical, genetic, and psychological data all into one place. So, how does an early career researcher or any scientist practice their open science? Well, these are the steps to take. So firstly, try to make all original materials and data available. So currently, the majority of researchers do not adequately provide published data and materials even after requests from others, and that's 62% published by Van Permel in 2015. So there are places to publish data and materials now. Those include OSF, the Open Science Framework, and code can be published on GitHub and made publicly available. Importantly, we need to make it all intelligible. So that is, we need to make all the materials and data intelligible, and that means organizing, labeling, and annotating. So for example, we need to label all independent and dependent variables, covariates, and demographics, and perhaps listing them in a pre-registration. In your experimental code, that means making sure your code is commented accurately and reliably so that someone understands how the code is running. And potentially having a data repository with README files. So the README files can explain what is stored and what each variable is actually measuring. And lastly, making it all discoverable, as I mentioned, saving it to accessible online repositories such as GitHub and Open Science Framework. Another way to practice open science is to pre-register confirmatory research. So confirmatory research has specified hypotheses prior to data collection, which allows them to be listed ahead of time. And what this targets is the analytical freedom to try and find any significant effect. So if you list out what hypotheses you were intending on collecting from the start and you follow through with that, people are assured that you didn't to undertake any questionable research practices to find significant effects. It should be noted that exploratory research creates new hypotheses after examining the collected data, and it may not be necessary to pre-register those exploratory research, but to increase the reliability of that research, follow-up studies on that exploratory research might be confirmatory and therefore can be pre-registered. And another thing is to join a large-scale replication project. So replication projects are always seeking participants, and they can be viewed on the APS website. One example of a replication project going on right now is called the Collaborative Replications in Education project, where any grad student can apply to be part of the replication project or even a reviewer of the project. Large examples of the replication project include the reproducibility project that I mentioned before, but also what is named mini labs. However, we have to be mindful of some objections to open science and why we might not want to undertake open science for now. So at the moment, acknowledging and confronting the problem can be problematic because it might impact future research funding. If the perceived opinion of science is that it's all broken and not working, then this might lead governments or others to withhold their research funding. And that's problematic. The truth is that these problems have been around for a while. Science is still working. It's just we are now actively and able to better correct and improve the work of science. So rather than us being in a crisis, we're more in a revolution. Part of the problem has been also that it's creating a divide between the old guard, so older and established researchers, and younger researchers seeking change. Another unfortunate side effect is that older and established researchers tend to be on selection committees, and this don't recognize the value or the need to undertake open science practices. Lastly, it may hurt the reputation of psychology and science, as I've mentioned. Open science can also potentially slow down scientific discovery and waste time. So for example, if you're required to do all the things like pre-register, make your data tidy and accessible, open and online, and have all your papers published in open access journals, it can take a lot of time for that project to finally be completed and added to the scientific body of literature. However, larger sample sizes also require more time, so larger sample sizes are needed to have more power in your study, and that might also require more money and resources. But note that these studies might actually yield more significant, accurate, reliable results in the long term given a model of replication, and that's posited by Will Gervais in his blog in 2014 and 2016. And another difficulty is that should all psychology studies be strictly pre-registered and adhered to? If this is the case, then this does not provide room to have exploratory or discovery in our studies. Perhaps there's something with hindsight that is important and valuable to accurately look into. As mentioned before, if it creates a divide between the older and younger scientists, it may produce inequities in evaluation because open science appears to take longer to produce and publish, which may lead to less published publications and greater susceptibility to criticism, and that may also become viewed as unfavorable in the job market because you have less publications, even though your findings are potentially more robust and reliable. And this is a problem with the incentive structure of science as it is currently. And one last point, one part of open science is opening it up at early stages. And for example, this has led to some public and political misunderstanding of science, especially in the misinterpretation of preprints. For example, in the media, when they publish preprints as if they are peer-reviewed research, and produce misinformation and movements on that misinformation from that misinterpretation. So hopefully I've covered all the ground of open science. If you've enjoyed that, please give this video a like or subscribe. Thank you.